Okay, First Samuel 16. And we'll start here in verse 1, and we're going to read the first 13 verses this evening here in First Samuel 16. And the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thine horn with oil, and go, I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. And Samuel said, How can I go? If Saul hear it, he will kill me. And the Lord said, Take an heifer with thee, and say, I am come to sacrifice to the Lord. And call Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will shew thee what thou shalt do, and thou shalt anoint unto me him whom I name unto thee. And Samuel did that which the Lord spake, and came to Bethlehem. And the elders of the town trembled at his coming, and said, Comest thou peaceably? And he said, Peaceably I am come to sacrifice unto the Lord. Sanctify yourselves, and come with me to the sacrifice. And he sanctified Jesse and his sons, and called them to the sacrifice. And it came to pass, when they were come, that he looked on Eliab, and said, Surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance, or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab, and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, Neither hath the Lord chosen this. Then Jesse made Shema to pass by, and he said, Neither hath the Lord chosen this. And Jesse made 7 of his sons to pass before Samuel. And Samuel said unto Jesse, The Lord hath not chosen these. And Samuel said unto Jesse, Are here all thy children? And he said, There remaineth yet the youngest, and behold, he keepeth the sheep. And Samuel said unto Jesse, Send and fetch him, for we will not sit down till he come hither. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, and withal of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil, and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this chance to be in your house this evening and to read from your word and to hear from your word. Pray that you would give me the words that you would have me to share this evening, and for the message that you would have for us to hear this evening. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. So God is constantly calling people to serve him, but many people don't hear or maybe don't heed his call. I can think of a couple times in my life when this would come into play. One of those being Awana, as Wilma mentioned, that I remember when we were meeting back over on Idaho Street. We got ready to start one night, and that's when Jerry was still the commander and Sandy was his secretary, and we got ready to start, and they weren't there yet. And I was like, well, it's time to get started. So I went in, I got the whistle, put it on my neck, and went in, and we got started. And we got started, no problems. Everything got going. Got them dismissed to class, and I was just in charge of games at that time. And I walked into the office, and Jerry came in, and we were chit-chatting. He's like, hey, you did a good job starting up. And I was like, wait a minute. I'm being trained for something, and I don't want to do it. Well, we see how that went. I don't know if I heard God's calling at that point in time, but I obviously didn't. He wanted to heed his calling. I didn't think that was for me. I didn't think I could do something like that. But as I look back on that, I know that I ran the children's church ministry here at the church for several years when we had a change in positions, and that's not really a calling or a position I was seeking for at that point in time either. But God has a calling for each and every one of us, and it's not the same for all of us. Sometimes we don't hear that calling, and sometimes we don't want to hear that calling. I think it's like, I can't do that. I guarantee you, I was 100% serious when I told Jerry. I said, I'm not interested. I don't want to do it. I can't do that. And then when Jerry retired, and then I was still like, I can't do it. I'm not going to do it. And then Michael Carpenter took over, and I remember when they were getting ready to make the move to California, and he was, I'm going to have to move. I was like, no, I can't do it. I'm not going to do it. But here we are, and I have done that and have managed to do that. So sometimes it's a matter of we get in our own way, we get in God's way for what He has planned for our lives, for what we feel. And so tonight I want to talk to you. We read about David here, and David being anointed to be the next king of Israel, and that was God's calling for David's life. And I want to take a couple minutes and look at a couple things in David's life to point out how David dared to answer God's call. The first thing we need to realize in our lives is that God prepares us for what He calls us to do. He doesn't just throw us out there and figure it out. He has prepared us for it, whether we realize that or not. And He's worked diligently to prepare us for that situation. Because if you think about a building, for a building to stand, it has to have a pretty strong foundation, doesn't it? If you can think about the Willis Tower or the Sears Tower, it's a 110-story building that stands over 1,400 feet tall. And for it to be able to stand that tall and to stand the test of time, it has a cement foundation that is 100 feet deep into the earth. And part of that is sunk into bedrock so that it can stand. That's the kind of foundation that we need to have, and why God prepares us for the calling that He has for us. And I said we're going to talk about David, and we'll talk about David in a minute, but we could look throughout the Bible and see lots of different men that God called to His service throughout the Bible. And I want to take a second to look at a couple of those people before we talk about David. The first one I would mention would be Joseph, and how God used Joseph to save Israel during the 7 years of famine. But I want to look at these because I want to mention that I said that God prepares us, but it's not necessarily the same preparation for everybody, because not all situation is going to be the same. God has a perfect plan for us to prepare us. So if you think about Joseph, his preparation started out when he got sold into slavery by his brothers, by his own brothers got sold into slavery. That would tend to, I think, make somebody pretty bitter. I mean, you think about it, you think you would hold a grudge for that, and we'll come back to that. But then it seemed like Joseph's life went from one bad event to the next bad event. Then he was bought, and the owner's wife accused him of making advances on her when he was doing the right thing by God's, trying to get out of the situation. So then he got put into jail. But all that to work to the good. And we can see that if we look in Genesis chapter 50, how Joseph's preparation made a difference in his life, and how he chose to use being prepared. After Joseph's family had moved to Egypt and his father died, they went to bury his father, and his brothers were fearful of Joseph, because they thought, now that Dad's gone, Joseph's going to take it out on us. He's in a position of power, and he's going to let us have it. If we look in Genesis 50 and look at verse 20, we can see what Joseph did with that preparation that God gave him. Joseph says, "But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive." So as opposed to being bitter about what was in his life, Joseph had realized and come to realize that God had prepared him and called him for the position that he was in, and that that affected or changed his attitude that I think most people probably would have had towards our brothers. I remember I wasn't always happy with my brother, and my brother never sold me into slavery. He might have been mean to me, but I didn't. I held a bitter attitude. But Joseph was prepared for that position that God put him into, and I think those bad times when those bad things happened, something good came of it. It always seemed like something bad was happening, but Joseph was patient, and something good came out of that, to the point where he was made second in command in all of Egypt, and then was able to save his family from that famine. We could also think about Moses. We're pretty familiar with Moses and what he went through. And God had prepared him for many years growing up in Pharaoh's house, and then leaving and spending time away. And then God spoke to him in a burning bush to ask him, to tell him what he wanted him to do. I said that people sometimes don't hear the calling, but then some people don't want to heed the calling. Moses, in my opinion, fallen into one of these guys who kind of didn't want to heed the call, kind of like me. I thought, I'm not going to do it. I can't do it because God says, "Hey, I want you to go lead the Israelites out of Egypt. I want you to save my people." And in Exodus chapter 4, Moses offers some excuses to God about, I can't do it. My excuses for not running Awanas is I don't have time, or I can't speak in front of people, or I don't know enough, or whatever the case might be. We can all come up with excuses, but Moses tried to offer a couple excuses to God. And in Exodus 4, chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "And Moses answered and said, But behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, The Lord hath not appeared unto thee." So Moses is like, they're not going to believe me. God, don't send me. Send someone else more important than me. But God worked through that. It's like, he showed him some signs. Here's some signs you can show them to show them that, I appeared to you. You are doing what I told you to do, and I sent you. And then Moses gave it another chance in verse 10. "And Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore, not since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and of a slow tongue." And I think that's what a lot of us want to use the excuse. I can't speak. And it doesn't have to be a large amount of people that God's calling you to. He may start you small to where you get to talking to larger groups. God started me talking and working with little children so that I could be up here tonight to speak in front of you. And before he did that, even though I taught kids at high school and did for better than 20 years, I still couldn't have stood up here and done this if God hadn't prepared me and started me young with working with younger children to get to the point where I can stand up here and speak in front of my elders and in front of my the members here at the church without just totally turning to jelly. So we need to heed God's call when he calls us, and don't try to offer the excuses, because believe me, God's got an answer for your excuses. The last one I'll mention would be the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. His preparation began when God appeared to him on the road, and he was blinded on the way to Damascus. And if we'll look in the book of Acts in chapter 9, we know that God appeared to him on the road, and then he was sent on into Damascus to wait. And he waited for 3 days before someone was sent to him. We'll pick up here in verse 8 in chapter 9 of Acts. In verse 8 it says, "And Saul arose from the earth, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no man, but they led him by the hand and brought him unto Damascus. And he was there 3 days without sight, and neither did eat nor drink." So the preparation we have that God prepares us for is not necessarily on our time. It's on God's timeline, and we need to be patient. So this was 3 days that Saul waited, and God sent Cornelius, is that right? Ananias to see him and to restore his sight and to get Paul headed down the path that God wanted him on. But Saul at that point in time still didn't just jump straight out and begin preaching. If you look in verse, where do I want to go? In the book of Galatians, Paul talks about the fact that he spent 3 years before he went to Jerusalem to meet with the apostles. So he spent time in preparation, preaching, but in preparation for what God wanted him to do. So we can see that God prepares the men and the people that he calls to his service. And tonight I want to look at a couple things that David did in his life. That was the preparation and what David did with that preparation to be able to fulfill that calling that God had for him to be the next king of Israel. First, we could see from David's life that he learned to know God. And when I say know God, many of us know sports figures or actors or whatever the case may be. We know who they are, right? And if it's a sports figure, you might know some statistics, batting average, shooting percentage, whatever the case might be for you thinking about. But do you really know the person? we got to be careful about saying that we know God. There's a difference about knowing about God and knowing God. And David knew God. David had a relationship with God. And I say that, and I would back that up by saying of the book of Psalms, David wrote 73 of those Psalms. And I don't think you can read those Psalms and not think about the relationship and the trust that David had to have with God to write those. If nothing else, if you think of Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I mean, that was someone who was truly speaking from his heart about his relationship with God. So this time that David spent keeping the sheep was not time that was wasted. I don't know how well I would have done at that job. I fall asleep rather easily. You could ask my wife. I could fall asleep in 5 minutes. I don't care what time of day it is. I'm pretty sure I probably would have got fired as a shepherd. I'd probably sat down behind a rock or in the shade or something, promptly fell asleep. But David spent that time with God. He did not waste his time that he had. He spent that time with God, developing a relationship with God. And that was part of the preparation that God had for David, was for David to seek him and for him to have that relationship with God so he could be a man after God's own heart, so that he could be a person that sought God. And David spent that time doing that. David also learned to use his gifts that God had given him. He didn't squander his gifts. He chose to use them. Two of the gifts that you can think about, you'll probably think about when you think about David would be his musical ability of playing the harp. And that goes, we can see that for the fact that they brought David to Saul to be able to comfort Saul and to play his harp for Saul when Saul was troubled. And David did a very good job of that. Plus, the aforementioned David wrote 73 of the Psalms, those songs that he would sing. So we know that David had some musical ability that he used, and he also had some fierce toughness that he used. If you look in 1 Samuel we started in 16, but if you look over in chapter 17, in verse 34, I'll read a couple verses here for you. It goes on to say here, and David said unto Saul, as David's trying to convince Saul that, hey, I can go fight Goliath, let me go. And David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. So we see that David used his gift of being courageous. I don't know how else you'd describe that, being courageous, his ability to also use his sling to be able to protect his father's sheep. So David honed his gifts, and when God used David to defeat Goliath, it was because David was faithful in his younger years to practice his skills that God has given him, his courage, to use that courage to be able to defeat Goliath and to save, the Israelite people from the Philistines. So we see that David took the time to, in that preparatory time in his younger life, to get to know God, to develop a relationship with God, which is something that we all need to do and can't be underscored, that we need to have that relationship with God on a daily basis, not just on Sundays and Thursdays or Wednesdays, whatever the case might be. We need to seek that relationship with God, to have that relationship with God. That helps us to, I think, be more willing to choose or to be willing to accept those callings that God has for us in our lives and to see those opportunities that God has for us. So we see that David had a relationship with God, and we see that David had skills, but those two things alone won't do much if you don't have dedication to go with it. And if we look at David's life also, we can see not only did he have that relationship with God, and that dedication meant that it was a daily relationship with God, not just a couple days a week, not when I have time. David used all of his time that he had to have a relationship with God. He had dedication. We can see that what David's dedication was, because we know that David was a shepherd, right? So he was keeping his father's sheep. We can see early on, and even with what we read this evening, we can see David's diligence for the jobs that he was given to carry those out. Because when Samuel came to anoint the next king of Israel, and he was looking at all of Jesse's sons, where was David at? He was still out in the field watching the sheep. I would assume he probably knew what was going on, had an idea, at least, hey, somebody's here. He didn't leave the sheep to go see what's going on, to go have that good meal. He stayed to finish his job. And we can see that further on, that when David's father sends him to go see his brothers out there at the battlefield, where he ultimately confronts Goliath, we see that David was diligent in his job, because he didn't just get up and leave his sheep. He found someone to watch the sheep before he left. I mean, it would have been one thing. Dad told me to go. All right, I'm gone. I don't have to watch these sheep anymore. I get to go. As his brothers thought that he came just to see the battle, just a nosy little kid wants to see what's going on. We see that David was diligent, that he actually did the job that he was told to do. David practiced, and like coaches tell kids nowadays, I've heard several times, practice like you want to play. So David wanted to be faithful to God, so he became faithful in the responsibilities that God gave him, of the small things that God gave him, even of watching his father's sheep. And we need to realize that God prepares us to be faithful in the small things as well as the big things. If we can't be faithful in the small things, then it's going to be hard or impossible for us to be faithful in the big things that God gives us to do. There are no small jobs that God has for us. I could have seen teaching a Sunday school class or something as a small job that God, and it's not important. But those steps that I mentioned earlier this evening are steps that God used to prepare me for what I'm doing now, and to prepare me to be able to help run a children's ministry at the church and to do what's needed. He used those, what some people would see as small jobs. Even I used to drive the church bus. Even as driving the church bus seems like a small little thing. But all those were things to teach me diligence, teach me dedication to what I was doing, so that I'm able to carry out what he wants me to do. I kind of have a rolling joke when we look at attendance at Sunday school. I'm always looking to see who's winning, who's missed the least amount of days, and I can't proclaim that I haven't missed any days in the recent past, but I do know, people. My brother will ask me to come over and do something, on a weekend. I'll be like, that's fine, but I got to go home Saturday evening, so we got to be done by 6 or 7. I got to be home, so I want to be at church. Yeah, I can go to church with you, but I want to go to my church. So God uses us in those situations to be able to prepare us for what we need to do, and we need to keep in mind that there are no small jobs with God. Everything is a big job to prepare us for the next thing that he wants us to do. Everything is a significant task for God. It was David's preparation and dedication that God revealed when God revealed his calling on David's life to be the next king of Israel. And I'd mentioned this earlier, but as I begin to wrap up this evening, I want to tell you that there are some other things that David did that were very important. He waited on God's timing. David was anointed king of Israel, but he didn't run right out and take that job. He waited on God's timing for God to appoint him as king of Israel. And even when Saul became mean to David, tried to kill David several times out of jealousy, David still waited on God's timing. And we can read that David even had the chance in a cave to take Saul's life, and the men that were with David were encouraging him to, but David still waited on God's timing. The preparatory period that God has for us to be able to answer his call might be short, as I've mentioned. It might be long, but we need to realize that God has a plan, and we need to wait on his timing for him to prepare us for what he wants us to do. And we also need to be willing to accept God's calling. As I've mentioned, God called me into children's ministry, and I at first went kicking and screaming. But I did go. I guess that's better than not going at all. But God will not call us to do something we can't do. It may be challenging. We may think we're not going to be able to do it. But I guarantee you, with some prayer, with some thought, with some faith in God, God will get you through that. There's many times I've had situations happen in my professional life where I'm like, I don't understand why this is happening to me. I want to play the old pity party card of why this happened to me. I'm a good person. I'm better. But it's happening. I've learned to change my attitude over the years of not why is this happening to me, but God, I don't know why this is happening to me, but I trust you, and I hope I can learn the lesson you're trying to teach me, so I come out better on the other side of this situation. And that's the type of attitude we need to have with God's calling. Of God, I don't know if I'm qualified. I don't know if I'm capable, but if this is what you want me to do, and I'm seeing this is what you want me to do, I can do it. And I'm gonna lean on you for that guidance and that help to get through there. So like David, we need to be willing to answer God's calling in our lives. And it may seem meaningless, or it may seem small or insignificant, but as Sharon mentioned this evening about the Bibles that were bought through the VBS, we know God's word does not go out void. It's going to be answered, and it's going to have an impact. And the positions that God calls you for, you will have an impact. You may not ever realize it, but you're going to have an impact on somebody's life if you're heeding God's calling. He does not send you out to not accomplish anything.